Welcome to What's at Stake, a show about decentralized governance and the Cosmos Hub. My name is Mai Ishikawa Sutton, a contributor at Haifa Worker Co-op, and I'll be your host for this hour. Before I introduce our guest, Josh Tan of the Metagovernance Project, I'm going to give a brief intro to the topics we'll be covering today. A super rough outline of how proof-of-stake blockchains work, the governance role validators play on those networks, and how this all relates to the Cosmos Hub. So validators play an integral role in how proof-of-stake blockchains work. Instead of miners on a proof-of-work blockchain, it's the validators that propose and approve valid blocks to be added through a consensus process. The stake in proof-of-stake refers to how validators stake tokens to back up the assertion of what data the next block should contain. On the Cosmos Hub, validators bond Atom tokens to the protocol, meaning they stake them. And while they're bonded, they're able to propose and produce blocks and receive rewards for doing so. The more Atom a validator has staked, the more frequently they're selected to produce blocks, and therefore they receive more rewards. On Cosmos chains, at least, this is where governance comes in. Anyone with tokens can stake them to any number of validators. Individuals can decide to stake with a validator based on their different commission levels, like the amount that the validator takes as their service and gives the rest of the rewards to the delegators, the reliability and uptime of a validator, and the alignment that delegators have with the values of the validators that they're staking with. If Atom holders, the delegators, don't like how the validator is behaving, they can choose to redelegate to others. They can choose to vote on their own if they choose. If they don't vote, they automatically inherit the decisions of the validators they've staked their tokens with. Individual token holders can also help sway the entire conversation of governance by participating in deliberations on Twitter, topic-specific chats, and on the project's forum. So delegators have the ultimate power, and they can hold validators in check, but at the same time, it's validators that heavily weigh voting outcomes. So it's like validators are like politicians. They express the will of those who delegate their power to them, but it's the validators that are exercising the power itself. So with Josh today, we're going to be talking about his project, Metagovernance Project, this new political party called the Validator Commons, and explore from those projects, what are the power tensions that arise in proof-of-stake networks in general? How do different validators and other stakeholders balance and align on intentions and objectives? And how do validators help to decentralize a blockchain network? Or vice versa, how is it that validators and the ways that they function on proof-of-stake networks maybe concentrate power and decision-making? So I am joined by Lexa Michaelides on the Cosmos Hub Gov team. She's been activating governance deliberations on the Cosmos Hub forum and helping shepherd key governance proposals on-chain. She's watching the conversation today and will jump in with comments or questions. Hey, Lexa.
Hello.
So now let me introduce Josh Tan. He's the executive director of the Metagovernance Project, a practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab, and a doctoral student in computer science at Oxford. He conducts applied research on collective intelligence and the governance of online communities. Thank you for joining us, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
So can you start us off by telling us a bit about your professional background and how you got into this governance work?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of a long and winding road, long and winding story. So I really grew up within mathematics. That's where kind of like my basic training is, and more specifically as an algebraic topologist. And I was doing research on applying certain branches of higher mathematics, especially something called category theory, to essentially to AI, to sort of different aspects of artificial intelligence, especially machine learning. At some point, I very randomly started working with this video game company in Berlin. It's called Clang Games, and they were building an MMO. So for those of you who don't know, it's like massively multiplayer online game. And the group of people working on this were a bunch of veterans of EVE Online, which is kind of like a old school MMO featuring like big battles in space, and more importantly, this fabulous construction called an EVE Online corporation, which in many ways was, I won't go deep into corporations, just suffice to say they were pretty fun and pretty exciting and extremely complicated part of this game, part of the end game of this MMO. And these EVE Online veterans said, no, these corporations, they are not complicated enough. We need to go all in on governance, all in on, this like making up this politics of this virtual world, which is exactly what they're doing and have been doing for the past few years. Long story short, I was there kind of helping them with their, design their virtual economy. I won't sort of say why or how I was justified that. I don't think I was, but it was just a really fun sort of exercise to do that. But I was working alongside this professor named Lawrence Lessig, who's a sort of professor of constitutional law and of cyber law at Harvard. And Larry and I essentially, started chatting, and one thing leads to another. And about 3 months later, I'm helping him teach a course on the governance of virtual worlds at Harvard. And this course was, I kid you not, it was just about getting law students to play video games. That's essentially the entire sort of subject that went. I mean, okay, there's a little bit more. There's like actually, we gave them quite a bit of reading, but they were supposed to play video games and kind of report on what they learned on playing these video games, observing the game design, observing the the economics, and sort of the governance that was embedded in the design of these platforms. And essentially, after that, we almost immediately after the end of the class, Larry and I, along with a couple of other people who have been guest speakers in the course, decided, hey, we're trying to solve all these different problems in MMOs, in blockchains, in social networks, in messaging platforms like Slack. And instead of trying to build, different solutions across all of these things, maybe we could build just one solution for all of these different settings. Turns out that's a little bit hard, at least much harder than we thought it was. But that's essentially how we began the Metagovernance Project.
I see. And so that idea of creating like tooling that can be used and applied for these different spaces, that's the idea of modular politics?
Exactly. So modular politics specifies, so modular politics, for those who don't know, is kind of like the Metagov white paper, but it's also like an actual academic paper accepted to like a CSCW, which is like a journal, a conference. And what it presents is kind of a basic template for how to build a governance layer for the internet. And it spells out a few like basic data models and sort of certain hypotheses about how to build all this, how to make it interoperable. And yeah, so Metagov is all about what it's trying to do is exactly build that governance layer for the internet following roughly the spec that was articulated in that original white paper.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I want to ask you a little bit more about what your thoughts are on how those toolings or those practices and norms are kind of like able to be translated maybe outside of online communities. But I think I'll loop back later on in the conversation on that. So what are some of the projects that Metagov is working on that you're excited about?
Well, I think I'm supposed to be excited by all of them. Otherwise, it would look pretty awkward. But I am actually excited by really like our projects are. For example, we just launched, I think 2 weeks ago, a new project called the Constitutions of Web3, where we've gone through a bunch of different DAO constitutions, interviewed a bunch of founders and authors of these constitutions, like for example, for ENS, and wrote a paper analyzing these things, presenting kind of the common patterns, and made a series of recommendations that I think is actually, really finding a little bit of traction and interest in the ecosystem. So, for example, this isn't official, but we're talking to the founders or the sort of the key contributors behind one of like a really, really big DAO right now, who's thinking about essentially tossing out their old constitution in order to follow this new template. And yeah, so that's quite exciting. On top of that, we run something called DAOstar, which I've been told is the closest thing to a UN for DAOs that currently exists. It's roughly speaking, it's a standards body that builds open standards, especially like sort of API standards for DAOs that helps them kind of publish common data. So that's been quite a lot of work, and we're hopefully going to be, launching a few new things relatively soon out of that project. And well, of course, the longest running project in Metagov is something called the Metagov Gateway, which is an API gateway that basically helps you take tools and platforms, like especially for governance, for example, like Lumio or some sort of voting app, and makes it more accessible within the platforms where decisions actually need to be made or where communities actually live. So you can imagine like a voting application like Polis or Snapshot or Lumio, and you want to sort of like embed it as a small little application or connect it somehow to Slack or to Discord or to Discourse or wherever it is that where your community actually lives. So basically extending the power, at least the governance sort of capabilities of these existing platforms by connecting, other tools and making them more accessible. So that's the Gateway project. Besides that, and I'll shut up soon. There's actually, I think, just a lot of different, more qualitative research, and I suppose quantitative research that Metagov does. So obviously we build a lot of institutions and build a lot of, like we're talking about standards bodies, but we also build a lot of like research data sets. The constitutions of Web3 was one example, but for example, Lucia, who's our data scientist, has been working super hard for the past 6 months, building a big library of DAO sort of contracts. So like literally the smart contracts, breaking them down, analyzing them, and setting them up so they're much more can be much more directly compared. So like this governance setting or this parameter corresponds to that parameter in that framework, and helping us sort of better understand, like, when you deploy some of these contracts, deploy a DAO, this is how it actually works. And okay, last but not least, there's the Validator Commons, which I think we'll maybe have some time to get into later.
Yeah, I do want to dive into that. But I guess what's interesting about your work is I feel like in some of these spaces, like you were describing DAO stars like the UN, the like constitutions of Web3 obviously takes, I'm sure in some of those communities, like take inspiration from existing like constitutions outside of online communities. But this kind of like interaction between, the separateness or like the globalness, I guess, of communities that are trying to coordinate and align on things and make decisions together, and how they're sometimes taking like heavy inspiration from existing governance systems and then sometimes just kind of completely breaking that open or kind of like hacking it. What do you think are ways in which I guess like the legacy governance systems or these like the language and norms around that helps, but then sometimes maybe it doesn't, it can feel more constraining?
Yeah, this is a really deep question, a really good question. I think there's blockchains and DAOs, and let's say all of crypto/Web3 have a lot to learn from politics as it exists today, from institutions that exist in the real world. Everything from cooperatives to obviously like companies to governments to the constitutions of these national national entities. But there's like a million different things in between, from political parties to trade associations, trade alliances, like sort of public-private partnerships. There's just like people don't realize, I suppose, if they don't think about it, or if they're not, like deep into the space, that there's like this whole panoply of institutional forms that exist out there. These so many ways that you can sort of like set up these contracts in the sense of a legal contract as opposed to a smart contract. And there's a lot, I think, that we need to learn from these sort of subjects and learn. I think that's important because it'll help this entire space move much faster and hopefully make fewer mistakes that have already been made. At the same time, it is true that our intuitions about politics, for example, are really, really embedded or sort of subservient to or inspired by our intuitions for national politics or for local politics, right? And that isn't necessarily the case, or that need not be the case. Politics in crypto or on a blockchain or in a DAO do not have to look like the politics that we're familiar with, and it does not have to, lead to the same kinds of inequities and the same kind of, let's say, polarization that is, that you see very commonly in political systems today. That's not to say that they're not going to have their own problems, but we shouldn't benchmark all our expectations on about politics and governance in crypto on politics and governance in outside of crypto. And I guess to be quite frank, part of the reason I got into this space is this assumption that politics and governance could be new, that there was this possibility, this shining hope that there was something new, fundamentally new, that was possible on the internet, some way of organizing ourselves, organizing our institutions that was not possible, in the real world. Well, certainly there were all these vested interests and government moves super slowly. And there's just very little innovation in that space, that we can innovate within the internet and build something sort of really fabulous, really, really amazingly new. And I think that is still possible, but we need to, shed the presumptions and the sort of things that are holding us back, that we're carrying over from real space, I suppose, from meat space.
Right. Or digital, or that kind of digital real kind of dichotomy sometimes is not always accurate. But yeah, I guess legacy is one way to put it. And how right. I really like that answer. Well, speaking of the kind of extending existing political structures to these new spaces. So Validator Commons is what you all have called the first blockchain political party. Can you talk a little bit about how it's a traditional political party?
Yeah. So let me kind of first introduce what the Validator Commons is, how it got started, and maybe that'll give you a little bit of context because it was for us, it was quite a it took 4 months before we came to the decision to call this thing a political party. And we actually iterated through a bunch of different institutional forms and names for how we thought this project or this collection of validators and allies could be organized. So it really began when some guys at Stakefish, so Daniel Huang especially, reached out to me and to Metagov more broadly to kind of sort of explore how can we engage, how can we sort of bring together a bunch of validators to kind of identify what constitutes good governance from a validator perspective, or more specifically, how do we define a benchmark or a standard for governance participation from a validator, right? What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to be posting in forums? Should they be explaining all their votes? How many votes? Should they be participating in all votes, or just the most important ones? How do I say it? There's a bunch of different sort of policies that you can imagine for how governance participation should work. And we sort of had a long discussion sort of over multiple months to kind of put that, that standard or those set of practices together, to kind of working with a large number of validators, or not large, but several sort of large validators, including, obviously Stakefish, Figment, Chorus One, Chainflow, and others, to identify what are the best practices in validator governance. So as we were working through, putting this together, identifying what constituted good governance, or a reasonable level of participation, identifying some of the barriers for validators, especially smaller ones, right? That don't have necessarily the manpower or the, just the amount of time to engage with all the things that might happen on chain. Talk about things like, do I want to sort of like essentially like kind of sub-delegate? What are the sort of like right levels like that I should be announcing? And also like, what's the tension? Because there is a tension between, let's say, more kind of independent validators and the big centralized exchanges, which, generally speaking, as a rule, as a policy, do not participate in governance. And finally, what is the relationship between both of these entities to the foundations or core teams that operate these chains, right? There is fundamentally, you can't just like pretend it doesn't exist. There is politics, and there's a kind of a tension there. And all these different forces need to work together in order to produce a healthy sort of political ecosystem, a healthy sort of blockchain. And how do I say it? Anyways, so that was kind of like the set of conversations we were having. And as we were having these conversations, we started realizing, well, we could define this as a standard to say, hey, we've done a lot of research, and it's like, we've come to these conclusions, and there are, totally above board and neutral, and they should just become universally adopted, which is, like a way that often like technical standards bodies like the W3C or even like DAO-Star kind of approach things. But I think in this case, we kind of realized a lot of the assertions we were making, because they were so close to governance, were themselves somewhat political, that you could have differing opinions about them. And that while we believed in them, that we believed that, this represented a good way of being a validator and being a responsible validator, there were, not necessarily things that everybody across the board would agree with. Which is why we started thinking about, well, why don't we actually, in some sense, just like try to put these proposals out as actual proposals on these chains, and try to, make the change that we want to see, right? And as soon as we started talking about it that way, I think it became very clear that, this was something that looked a little bit like a political party, organizing representatives or voters within a well-defined political system in order to create change around a set of like sort of like basic shared values. I'll just throw in like one sort of other idea we sort of threw, institutional setup we've threw around was this idea of like being kind of like FINRA like entity, kind of like a voluntary kind of regulatory body that was the validators could kind of subscribe to, just like FINRA kind of regulates financial entities in the USA.
I see. Maybe this is a spicy question, I'm not sure, but so I know that there's like definitely a distinction between major exchanges that have so much staked with them, right? And they don't engage in politics, and I think that's like an obvious other, I guess, in this space. But like there's a group of people who've created this: Figment, Chainflow, Stakefish. Do you feel like there are other validators that would not be in Validator Commons that would like disagree with some of those values around like how much they should be engaging or not, or how transparent they should be?
I think like, we've had conversations with, let's say, like core devs and core teams at these, at chains. And there's a sense that, this is not a problem that like validators should or can solve. I think in a lot of these contexts, maybe there's like a lot of doubts about the general level of engagement of validators, to be honest. I think people have doubts about their ability to actually sort of participate responsibly in governance. And to be fair, that's like borne out by, some evidence, right? And certainly not like a sort of like a clear case, but many validators do have a hard time participating in governance, and they choose not to participate. And there are like clear economic incentives where they're like, oh, I need to like, offer lower fees, but not necessarily like they're not rewarded for participating in governance, at least not, not generically. There's also sort of like, like when we were like launching this project at Consensus, Ethan, one of the original sort of founders of Cosmos was there, and, we're just talking about like, well, we have this situation in which like validators are expected to be in governance. you gave us this responsibility, and now like you don't believe in us. Is that a problem with the core design? I was like, no. I mean, there's clearly sort of like trade-offs, I think. But the I'll say that I think a lot of the resistance that we've gotten has been more from like I think foundations and core devs who I think offer like a different perspective on, well, governance in these chains should not be like, you shouldn't have this kind of like this secondary institution on top of the existing validators. That it might actually, like if you look at it the wrong way, smells a little bit like, or even a lot like collusion, which is something we obviously don't want, and sort of hurts the decentralization of the chain. And their preferred solution to the fact that a lot of with the lack of governance participation, and with that the sort of increasing centralization of the chain, often like this centralization or sort of de facto centralization around a core team or foundation, is to say, oh, we just need like better code, right? Or we need to we can fix this through like protocol upgrades. I remember like sort of Dan saying something a little bit spicy there, which was, well, sure, but we still have to approve those protocol upgrades, which I thought was pretty funny.
Right. The code and the protocols aren't going to write themselves, right? I mean, for better or for worse, I guess.
For better or for worse.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the name. How did you come up with the name Commons? Like, I personally work in digital commons a lot, and when I saw it, I was like, oh, interesting that a political party would use the term commons. So what was the thinking behind that?
I think for us, and we kind of like hashed and sort of went back and forth on the name for the longest time. I think at some point we were what was it? Somebody threw out the idea of calling ourselves Nodes Are Us, which I thought could have been hilarious. But I think the reason we sort of settled on commons, besides the fact that I think we all appreciate and like the sort of the valence and the sort of the connotation of commons, especially we talk about public goods and we talk about sort of governing the commons, but also it has to do with the fact that I think for us, we weren't trying to like if you read the declaration, sort of the statement of what our values are, like really what we want to sort of articulate here is that governance matters. And we don't think that's like a very especially contentious proposition. I think in the details it does become more contentious, but there was a sense that we were trying to create a commons amongst a bunch of different validators, given the sense that being a validator means more than just like getting a lot of stake. It also meant being sort of like stewards of this commons, which is the chain itself, right? And that to be good stewards, you had to participate in governance, and that was like a fundamental sort of public good that was necessary to maintaining these commons, these chains.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think like personally, when I started to get into thinking about the digital commons and resources as the kind of focus of a commons, I like flip that. And like, actually, people like David Bollier and people who've been writing about the commons have been focusing more on the relationships between the people who are, becoming aligned to then protect that resource. So it's like, actually, when you focus more on the people and the relationships of that community that is caring for this commons or caring for a resource, it's actually a lot more constructive in a way to say like, it's not just about like, this pond that's getting, that's getting like garbage in or whatever. It's like, instead of this passive thing, it's become this active thing of like, okay, how do we then repair the relationships between the people who are taking care of it? And I think it clicked for me while you were saying that, like, okay, yeah, like it makes sense that if validators are being framed as like stewards of a chain, at least like one of the part of the stakeholder like network of people who are stewarding a chain, that it would be like a commons in that way.
Exactly. Commons are not just the resource or the underlying artifact. It is the community that uses and stewards and ideally like husbands that resource.
Right. I feel like you've talked a little bit about this already, but what's the kind of the focus of Validator Commons seems to be fixing governance, right? But what are the kind of like other problems, I guess, it's aiming to solve on proof of stake blockchains?
Yeah, there's there's a lot of different proposals that we're kind of like how to say, ideating and organizing. So one of the first things that we're going to be doing, because we really only launched relatively recently, is to organize a series of proposals, which is the entire point of calling a crypto party, on a series of chains. So one of the first things that we're thinking about right now is, for example, defining a constitution for Juno. So there's something we've been talking about, different sort of parts of that community, some of the core devs, some obviously like a lot of the existing validators that validate for Juno are represented in the commons, and just trying to figure out like how can we sort of organize some consensus, at least in this little subgroup, and then sort of like put that out there for the larger sort of community to sort of evaluate and sort of see if this is something that is going to be useful and good for Juno. And this is an example of where like the Validator Commons is organizing this this essentially it's kind of a public good, more like a club good, I guess in this case, shared research that's being pooled across a number of different validators, right? It might be like too much for a single validator to say, I'm going to write this entire constitution and put in the research, but it might make a lot of sense for like a bunch of different validators to pull together and say, hey, we all care about this. Let's pull together some resources, pull together some attention, combine our expertise, and pull together this like proposal. So that kind of research work is one of the things that we're hoping to contribute. It's not directly beneficial to proof of stake blockchains, but the hope is like organize some of these like softer institutions to make them more efficient, to make it so that these proposals, good proposals, appear more often, and hopefully the spam is the noise to signal ratio is a little bit better, more in favor of the signal. We've also talked about offering, like, for example, I think I remember like recent one of the projects that I think you guys are working on, like profiles of validators, right? And what I think I would love to sort of like work on is not exactly profiles, but one of the things we've been talking about is these assessments of like validators, almost like I think was it Nick from How, which is like a small validator, recently came in a call and had a great idea, which is putting together like almost like a peer review system for validators. So we would come up with, we have like a big sort of set of criteria for what constitutes like good governance participation, or here are all the different ways you could participate in governance within a given chain. And that's basically a set of questions, and it's something, basically a tool that we can sort of say, hey, if you're a given validator, why don't you like peer review the practices of this other validator and sort of give us a sense of like, what are they doing and sort of some other validators doing for you, and we can use that to bootstrap a set of you can think of them as profiles, or just a sense of like, hey, this is like what these validators are actually doing, how are they actually participating in governance, and give a little bit of more of in-depth look at their practices that is obviously available from things like MinScan, right?
That's a really interesting idea. As the person on the Cosmos Hub forum who's been pushing the validator profiles and trying to get people to participate, one of the concerns with evaluating validators is like, who's the person making this report card? What's their agenda? What are they trying to accomplish through this process? I really love the idea of this peer review, peer evaluation system.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was just because the original reason, like, a lot of these validators came to Metagov is we were this neutral third party, right? And, we specialize in governance, and technically we could do these assessments, but it's just hard to scale. And I mean, like FINRA does this, for example, which is why we were like banding around the idea of becoming this like more like sort of voluntary regulatory body. But also it's just like, it feels somehow a little bit cleaner to try to run this as a peer reviewed system. Obviously you still need to design these things, and there's still like obviously like certain incentives. You don't want to like have your reviewers shafting you because they're kind of your competitors. But also it's just because like who is going to know better than another validator if you're up to some hijinks that are, where you're up to no good, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was Chainflow has written about like the problem of decentralization with validators, and part of that sort of critique is the economic, the capital accumulation, right, of the top validators versus others. Is that a problem that the Validator Commons kind of is aiming to possibly address in proof of stake blockchains?
To be quite honest, it's not something that we've really covered in our discussions yet. It is definitely something I've observed because obviously a lot of the validators I've been sort of continuously interacting with have been, representing some of the larger sort of outfits. But we've gotten a lot of engagement, I think, from smaller validators who are, often in a lot of ways very motivated by sort of questions around governance, by questions around like how to sort of get these things organized, and often, see a clear benefit to collaboration and what's the right word for this? Like participating in an entity like the Commons, right? Because it kind of helps them stretch their resources and helps them kind of like, how do I say it? Give them a context for some of the decisions they're trying to make. I also say like, oftentimes the larger validators have like specific, I don't want to say agendas, but they have like projects, right? And they say, hey, this is an opportunity to, take the project that I've been thinking about, like whether it's drafting a constitution or putting together more of a governance framework, and pass it through and this kind of like collective endeavor, and thus improve it, right? But in terms of the direct kind of like tensions between like the smaller validators, the interests of smaller validators and larger validators, that is not something that we've really discussed. And how do I say it? I'm looking forward to learning more about that issue because it's definitely going to come up one day or another.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I see those kinds of I guess critiques of a proof of stake network, for instance, like Cory Doctorow is very loud about this issue. Like I'm like, oh, this actually reminds me a lot of traditional politicians, right? Like if we're thinking about validators as politicians and we're seeing them, like some of them are much more well-funded and able to kind of like accumulate more sort of legitimacy, or at least like power, in the sense that they are like, at least in a traditional system, like elected more. But also in proof of stake networks, right, they then accumulate more power because then they get more rewards, therefore getting more staked with them, et cetera. That does seem like it's going to be a major issue in terms of like how is it that then we keep validators accountable just as much as like there's a question around keeping like core teams accountable, right?
Yeah,
which I kind of want to ask about, which is, or if you have a response to that.
So how is that? So the incentives of the chains themselves, you try to limit like the percentage of like stake that a given like validators or owns or runs, right? So there are certain like checks on that. It doesn't, of course, stop still some level of like accumulation and sort of crowding out of, smaller actors, which is obviously not like desirable in a lot of ways. I think like Chris's response to this is, oh God, I'm forgetting the name, but like, I think the Cosmos Validator League or something like that.
Yeah, it's called the Validators League. Yeah.
Yeah. To kind of like spread the stake around. And I think that's a really, really interesting idea. And to be quite honest, like, I'm not sure how to evaluate it yet. Because the way I would approach this is try to like build a bunch of different models, like mathematical models or dynamical system models, and see like, does this kind of work? How does this sort of change the chain? I think it's definitely something we should be like trying out and seeing like how it works. But I haven't like really done enough research to be able to evaluate it myself and sort of like have a hot take, as it were.
That's fair. Okay, which direction do I want to go into? I guess so you were talking about this a little bit about the question of collusion. I think it seems to me that it depends on who you're talking about and who's saying it. It's kind of like it could just be collaboration or it could be collusion, right? And it's kind of like positive or negative connotation of these words. But as you said that you did get some pushback about validators working together. In what ways do you think this can be a problem, I guess? I think sometimes like in traditional political systems, like we obviously see this problem where like it just kind of becomes this like lowest common denominator of policy that happens because they all kind of have to agree on something, but like more maybe like interesting or better policies don't get passed because of that. Do you see that kind of thing happening with Validator Commons or other like crypto political parties?
So my collaborator, first off, this is something I'll share kind of in the chat later. But my collaborator, Ellie Rennie, who's a professor at MIT and has been sort of really instrumental in helping set up the Validator Commons with me, wrote basically a blog post summarizing some of the discussions that emerged at Consensus, in which one of the sort of major sort of questions was around this question of collusion. Is this collusion? Is this not? Maybe instead of calling a party, you could call it something else to sort of like make that go away. My sense is like it's always going to be there because ultimately you're trying to bring together these like voting entities and getting them to coordinate at some level, right? So I actually have like done not with it. How do I say it? I've done I've done research on, let's say, collusion and antitrust in like outside of crypto, right? And the way like that in this case, like the federal government defines collusion in these cases is really, 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 really subjective. Actually, it's really hard to distinguish between like what is collusion and what is like not collusion. Sometimes it just literally comes down to intention, and it's a hard thing to sort of ascribe or describe or to sort of how to say validate when you're sort of looking at somebody and sort of say, oh, they had good intentions and these people had bad intentions. I would also say that at least in the case of the US, there are actually in pretty much every country, there are lots of incentives to foster coordination exactly in cases where essentially there's an evaluation where the public good, or the social good that is going to come out of this coordination will overshadow the sort of like potential for, let's say, collusive kinds of back deals or sort of coordination to increase prices, right? And this is especially in the case for things like research or technological development. Like governments will literally subsidize these things and say, hey, all of you like nominal competitors, get in the same room, please talk to each other. Because the idea is like there are all these like potential spillover effects. There are sort of like potential improvements or gains from producing technology that is then sort of either open sourced or spread around the entire ecosystem, and thus improving the quality of either a service or a product or whatever it is that a given industry can provide, right? And it's not like I've written an entire paper on this, but my sort of sense is that, and certainly my belief in sort of like helping operate and organize the commons, is that it is about producing public goods. That's why we even started calling the commons in the first place, right? We're not trying to increase or move the bottom lines of the participants, besides the fact that the commons itself is a relatively open entity that anybody can join. It's about promoting public goods. I think that's the sort of distinction you really have to sort of make in distinguishing between coordination and collusion. Right. What is the ultimate benefit to society, or in this case, to the chain?
Right. And on the Validator Commons website, And I think in general, people say core teams are undemocratic and unaccountable. I think like the sort of like defense of that from those teams would be like, oh, well, but we're creating public goods, right? Like we are actually doing things for everybody. It's even though I think in a lot of ways they are more or less accountable than validators, right? Because it's not like delegators can restake to them or whatever. So there is that level of that. Like, can you talk a little bit about that, like the criticism of core teams and that component in many of these proof of stake blockchains and even particularly Cosmos?
Yeah. So I think, how do I say this? Like Metagov does actually a lot of research on, let's call it like, you can call it progressive decentralization. We often use the words kind of exit to community around how to transition organizations from, let's say, founder style teams or benevolent dictatorships to things that are a little bit more democratically run, a little bit more decentralized. And as part of this paradigm or way of thinking about it, is kind of recognizes the fact that core teams are necessary, that foundations are necessary to preserve or keep these chains functioning and operational, right? A common sort of analogy that we've kind of drawn is like, foundations and core teams are kind of like the executives and validators are the legislature. It's unclear what the judicial is. But whether or not, that template for thinking about decision-making and operations in proof of stake blockchains is correct, I think that it is pointing out that like core teams and foundations are a legitimate and even necessary, I mean, probably like very much necessary part of most ecosystems, right? And that you can't just wish them away, nor would you even like necessarily want them to just like disappear, right? If it can often be very, very helpful to have like, a team that's like very invested in a chain and say, hey, I'm going to just fix this problem and like build this, like ship this code. And like one of the problems that, we talked about, like, for example, in the context of Juno is just like, these hundreds of validators, approving all these upgrades. And then like, oh, whoops, there's like one, address that gets mislabeled and suddenly like, millions of dollars suddenly disappear. It's like, who is responsible for that? Technically, like you could say the validators, because they're the ones who kind of responsible for actually approving this. But, it's hard to organize that level of, let's say auditing or technical sort of oversight among like 100 different validators, right? There are reasons that many organizations and many sort of like political institutions have something that looks like an executive.
Yeah, and I feel like that kind of speaks to this like ongoing tension between decentralization and having centralized power, right? Like even Validator Commons is this kind of hub, whether or not that's like centralizing power, it is creating a center of power in a multi-centered system. And how do you, because I feel like governance, you always need to have people talking to each other. I feel like that's like a fundamental thing for people to get on the same page, to be able to move forward as a community, whatever they're deciding, right? And so, what do you see, I guess, is this ongoing, or like, how do you kind of square that, I guess, that ongoing tension?
So I think of this as, it's a question of like, how do I bond a given community to a given, let's say, project, or in this case, like often like it's because it's a core team that's starting it usually, to a given like company or foundation or core team. And communication is absolutely essential, yes. But as these things scale, as relationships get more and more impersonal, you need institutions to sort of like work around that fact, to sort of get the sort of conversations flowing, to help facilitate those connections between, let's say, whether it's a centralized entity or it's just a relatively powerful sort of like organization in this space, and a much more like this loosely organized sort of or decentralized community, right? And the validators are, there's hundreds of them, right? They all have like different incentives, different sort of stages of, in their businesses, and it's like you need some sort of coordination mechanism, and that's in some sense like to me like the reason that political parties exist in a lot of cases, and it's the reason I think, at least a good reason, that the Validator Commons should exist, and things like it should continue to, should exist, and more parties could potentially and should potentially emerge to exactly to solve some of these coordination problems around, around effective decentralization.
Right. Well, okay, so we only have a couple minutes. I have so many more questions, but I guess I think to sort of like zoom out a little bit, you've been doing this work around modular politics and governance in online communities. Do you feel like this will these kind of norms and practices around governance will kind of like, I really don't like the term trickle down, but like emerge out or kind of like become part of a broader consciousness about how people share power and talk to each other? And I think like there's so little amount of experimentation that can happen in normal governance systems, especially the state, but even in like normal corporate structure, that it's really exciting that in DAOs and Web3, like so many things are happening. I feel like so many more people are talking about words like collusion, all this stuff. So like what is your kind of like optimistic view of this and how it would impact, I guess, other spheres of how we exist on this planet?
So I'll say first off, at the very least, I hope that we can, all the experiments that are being conducted in this space, can serve an educational purpose for whether it's like policymakers or corporate titans to say, hey, communities are not just inert sort of like consumer masses. They can be vital parts of an organization, of a company, of a business model, and they, can be trusted and should be sort of given the power to, govern themselves and to sort of contribute in their own ways to like a given product or a given service or a given sort of like arrangement. I think maybe I don't know if this is the most optimistic version. It certainly is going to sound maybe optimistic, but something I wrote recently is a long bet for DAOs. But obviously, I think it really covers like all the different kind of experiments with governance that are happening, even in layer ones. And the bet is that by 2032, decentralized autonomous organizations and other digitally constituted organizations will organize more assets in production than traditional legally constituted corporations. So in the far future, imagine a world in which, these Web3 organizations literally ran like more than half the economy of like the US or of Europe. I think that is one way, and I think perhaps like the most, sort of the most exciting way in which we could take some of the things that we're trying to build here, this more notions of democratic ownership, democratic governance, responsibility, but also like different advantages that I think, are germane to Web3 versus like legally organizations built around legal jurisdictions, and really, take that to the rest of the economy by convincing actually it's just better. It is just easier and more advantageous, and ultimately leads to better companies and better, better economics to have these, to build your company, even your like, your mom and pop owned restaurant as a DAO or as some sort of like Web3 entity, which I think would be so cool. Right.
Yeah, that sounds so cool to me. I mean, particularly because you just have more stakeholders and you have more people who are involved in making sure that those entities succeed. And we certainly don't see that happen in like the economy that we have today with, like what is it called? Like when investors buy a company and just kind of like sell it and strip it for all it's worth,
Oh, rating it, yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing. I feel like if DAOs or even like cooperative structures were in charge of that, that wouldn't happen as much. But I know we're out of time, but I wanted to see if you had anything that you wanted to promote or sort of call out, encourage people to check out.
Just go to validatorcommons.org, read the pledge, drop into one of our Zoom calls. It's like very much open, and be part of the movement and help us build better chains and better governance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh, for being on today, and really appreciate you sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me.